Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. On behalf of CFA Society Pakistan, I am pleased to welcome you all here. I am Maha Qasim. I'm charter holder and CIO at MCDRFP Savings and Investments. So today's session is about climate change, its impact, and the kind of problem, the severity of problem that we are facing and how soon we need to react. So before we really start the session and invite our speakers, few housekeeping rules, just like to highlight. So this session is about for an hour, so participants are requested to stay muted. You can please keep your videos off. Q&A will be at the end of session. You can submit questions through the chat box, and the recording of this session will be posted on our website and YouTube channel. So to begin the session, I'll first request CFA Society President, Mr. Abdurrahman Buraj, to share remarks and introduce our today's speaker, Maha Qasim. Buraj, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asim, and a very warm welcome to all the participants, CFA Society members and non-members who made the time and the effort to attend today's session. In line with our mission, the CFA Society strives to bring the best experts in the industry to educate you regarding the important issues impacting our economic and financial landscape. We are proud to have Ms. Maha Qasim with us. She has outstanding credentials. She went to Princeton and Yale. She's an expert. She has a very unique expertise. She's an expert on issues of environment and climate and energy and governance, and how all of these combine into public policy and private investment decision-making processes. So we're very grateful to her that she had made time to educate us, and we are hoping that you will enjoy today's session and learn from it. So with that, I thank you all once again, and I will request Ms. Maha to address and educate us, and the session will be moderated by Mr. Muhammad Asim, one of the most prominent members of our society, and he will moderate afterwards also. Thank you. Ms. Maha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Buraj Sir, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the CFA Society team for inviting me to speak at this webinar. So I do think that climate change is the most important and one of the most pressing issues of our time. And that's why I think it's important that the members of the CFA Society should also be taking it, I guess, seriously. So let me just quickly share my screen. So to begin with, I wanted to focus today on the economic impact of climate change in Pakistan. As most of you are aware, we are actually in real time living through the consequences of climate change this year. Many people have noticed that in countrywide overall, we seemed to jump directly from winter into deep summer. There was an extended heat wave during the months of April and May. And then recently we're seeing wildfires in different parts of Pakistan, including the Balochistan pine forests, where such events were not observed before. So all of these changes are happening as we speak, and something needs to be done very urgently, I think, to either help adapt to climate change in Pakistan. I will not focus so much on mitigation in today's presentation, just because overall Pakistan still has one of the lowest per capita carbon footprints in the world. This is just the flow of the presentation. I will not spend too much time here. Introduction, and then it's so just for those of you who are not very familiar with what climate change is, climate change is essentially the change in average weather conditions over an extended period of time. And while it can be natural, in the past we've observed ice ages and extreme weather fluctuations. In recent years, since the start of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, climate change is largely man-made. And this is because of the burning of fossil fuels, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels. Some of the biggest emitters are the energy industry, the overall industrial manufacturing processes, land use change, agriculture. And essentially what happens is that the burning of fossil fuels releases greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, and there are around 5 others, including methane, water vapor, sulfur dioxides, and nitrous oxides. And so there are around 6 greenhouse gases which trap the excess heat from the sun, resulting in a rise in planetary temperature. So the world today is around 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in the early 18th century, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere in particular has almost tripled. So these are just some of the basics of climate change. There are 2 ways to address this problem that we're now facing, and globally there's been a lot of attention, I think, in this year in particular, since we're coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are 2 ways to address the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The first is either through offsetting or nature-based solutions like afforestation or preservation of existing forests. And the second is through direct air capture, and these are through technological solutions to essentially suck out the carbon dioxide from the air and permanently store it either underground or in materials for a certain period of time. Ideally for the next 200 years. So these are all technological solutions that are being proposed. And globally, there's also been a renewed movement towards carbon neutrality, or a drive towards the net zero economy. And net zero essentially means having a balance between how much carbon dioxide a country or a company or a city even emits and how much it absorbs. So essentially the balance should be equal. There shouldn't be, emissions essentially should not increase, and the deadline that's been set for this globally is 2050. But the European Union countries in particular have been at the forefront of driving this initiative, and they're actually aiming for even more ambitious climate action because if left unchecked, it's been unequivocally proven that the Earth will become unlivable in the near future if the emissions trajectory is allowed to increase in a business as usual scenario. So these are some of the key socioeconomic indicators. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, these show that we are very poorly equipped to deal with the impacts of climate change. Already, our socioeconomic indicators rank quite poorly versus our peer countries, including India, Bangladesh, even Nepal and Sri Lanka. The population that is undernourished is almost 13% of the total population, and in some parts of the country, including parts of Sindh and Balochistan, malnutrition is almost 43%, found in 43% of newborn babies and children. And this directly impacts human productivity and development later down the line. The national poverty rate during the most recent survey was around 24%. The bottom quintile, so the bottom 20% of our population holds less than 10% of the country's wealth. Infant mortality rate is still significantly higher than our regional peers. And essentially, urbanization is increasing at quite a high rate. It's almost 2.5% per year. And currently, almost 37% of our population lives in urban areas. Most of these are focused in sort of the geographies around since our economy is largely dependent on agriculture. And finally, as you're all aware, our government expenditure ratio to GDP the spending is quite low. It's around 21.5%. And because we are in the middle of an economic crisis, this is unlikely to get better in the near future, at least. The agriculture sector is, I would say, the most important from an economic standpoint and also from the perspective of climate change impacts on the country. It employs almost 40% of the labor force. It has one of the lowest productivity rates in the world. Just as an example, we picked Egypt, which, even though it has similar, I would say, demographics to Pakistan, their sugarcane yield, just one crop, is almost 50% higher than that of Pakistan. So this just puts, our agricultural productivity in perspective compared to some of the other countries of similar kind of economic demographics. So the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, and these include floods, droughts, tropical storms, and in the longer term, water scarcity are among the key impacts of climate change in Pakistan. And these are both observed impacts, which is impacts that we've seen in the last 10 years and which are becoming more frequent and more intense, almost annually. And then the projected changes, which will occur kind of slightly down the line. Globally, Pakistan ranks number 8 in terms of the disaster risk level for flooding. And for water scarcity, it ranks number 3 globally. So Pakistan actually was, I would say it was a water-stressed country in the last 10 years, but more recently it's actually being ranked as a water-scarce country. And one of the biggest contributing factors is our unchecked population growth. And then secondly, the inefficient use of irrigation for agriculture. So projected temperature increases in Pakistan are also significantly higher than the global average. Average globally is around 3.7 degrees Celsius, but in Pakistan, and especially in the northern areas of the country, the temperatures are forecasted to increase by almost 5.3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. These were some of the different climate scenarios that have been developed by the UN IPCC, the international governing body that essentially is monitoring the rates of climate change globally. And according to these projections, in the worst case scenario, Pakistan does face quite a high temperature increase by the end of this century. So in the next century, for the next generation, this bodes pretty badly, I would say. So some of the observed changes that we've already seen so far, these include heat waves, droughts, and flooding. The probability of a heat wave across the country has increased from almost 3% in the last decade and could go up to 23%. For droughts, severe drought conditions have an annual probability of between 25 to 65%. And then flooding is another, as I mentioned earlier, one of the major climate challenges for Pakistan. So by 2035, almost 5 million more people will be directly impacted by floods, largely as a result of their location and overall vulnerability or their inability to cope with some of these changes, largely due to poverty and lack of access to basic infrastructure and health facilities. So in the longer term, because Pakistan's economy is so heavily dependent on agriculture, it's 19% of the GDP, employs almost 40% of the labor force, and largely almost 65 to 70% of the population depends on agriculture for its livelihood. This is either through the service industry or the textile industry or generally exports. So this is probably the most important sector for Pakistan's economy, and especially because of its vulnerability to climate change. This is where I think most of the attention needs to be focused on. So even in the best case scenarios, and these are global numbers, we can expect a 5 to 6% decline in global wheat and maize yields. And another factor which is maybe not looked at as closely is the reduction in labor productivity. So the human body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius, but for every 1 or 2 degrees increase in your environmental temperature, your labor productivity declines by almost 10%. Rice and sugarcane are the two most affected crops under a high emissions scenario, with declines in yield of between 25 to 20%. And finally, Pakistan has the highest water intensity in the world. This was actually quite a surprising figure for me as well, but this is largely due to inefficient usage. And this is because most of the irrigation in the agriculture sector, it's through open channels, and there's a large percentage of evaporation and water that essentially is wasted or unused. I mean, in the large scale of things, it's not wasted, it's part of the water cycle, but essentially when you are using a lot more water for a very small relative output. So inefficiency is very high in this same sector. Some of the extended economic impacts that we've already observed. So between the period of 2015 to 17, the livestock output was reduced by almost 48%. Earlier this year also, for those of you who follow this, we did see scenes, especially in the Thar and like the rural same areas, for people having to bury their livestock because of lack of fodder and lack of fresh water for them. So this is a very real threat in the livestock sector. The floods, in addition to sort of displacement and loss of life, they also affect the unharvested crops. In 2010, the cost was around $5.1 billion. And this, of course, with increasing intensity and increasing frequency of floods, this number is expected to increase. In the longer term, one of the trends that is being observed in other countries and which likely will come to Pakistan as well is that shift in, as I mentioned earlier, the population from the rural areas to the urban areas. So with lower productivity, the farmers will essentially not be able to make ends meet. And they will gradually start leaving the farming, subsistence farming profession and moving towards other sectors. And this has very important consequences for the agricultural economy because they are essentially the backbone of our country's GDP and workforce. And this is something that needs to be tracked and addressed, I think, very, very immediately, because this is a trend that has been observed in the last few years, and it's set to actually intensify in coming years. And finally, due to heat waves and water shortages, just this year, there was almost a 50% reduction in the mango production, and there were lower mango exports as a result. This is just one crop, of course, that I'm talking about, but there are, I'm sure, several others that have been equally impacted. And as I mentioned, this is because of rising temperatures, unprecedented temperatures in months like March, April, and May, where usually, it doesn't get as hot as it did this year. So these are trends, it's I would say relatively hard to predict, but we do need to start preparing for them and maybe amplifying research in these particular areas. So with a growing population and lowered agricultural production, Pakistan's current account deficit is expected to become worse, both on the import and the export sides. The Global Climate Risk Index 2021, and this is an annual report that comes out, it ranks Pakistan as number 8 on the World Mobility Index. The other two kind of highly ranked countries are Myanmar and Bangladesh. But Pakistan, the overall losses in US dollars of purchasing power parity are higher than for the other two countries, and our losses per unit of GDP, at least compared to Bangladesh, are also higher. Overall, the CRI estimates that our average annual losses, just losses due to climate change, are almost $3.8 billion. And to put that in perspective, almost half of that is due to disaster-related losses. So essentially, if we were better prepared, these losses could be quite easily avoided. Another major concern is food security. Globally, already prices are rising, not just in Pakistan, but globally due to other kind of geopolitical factors as well. And currently, almost 60% of our population is food insecure. So climate change will essentially make that worse. There are technologies out there that can better predict what's going to happen. There's a need for training farmers, for employing more technological practices in the farming and agricultural sector. Right now, I guess I'll just focus on the key concerns and we can get to the solutions later. But the other major impacts include sea level rise, saline intrusion, destruction of mangroves, increased rainfall and cyclonic activity, an increase in displacement and migration, both internal and external. And finally, something we need to start preparing for now. Research suggests that on average, just a 1 degree increase in ambient temperature leads to almost a 0.5 to 8.5% increase in electricity demand. So right now in Pakistan, we're already seeing massive shortfalls. There are, of course, other factors due to that as well, but the usage is also expected to increase, especially in the summer months for cooling and for chilling across the country. Finally, globally, there's a lot of interest in supply chain decarbonization, and this is something that we are working on quite closely with some of our key industry players. So Pakistan will have to invest very heavily in renewables, with companies facing a lot of regulatory pressure to invest more. So these are trends globally, which will eventually, come to Pakistan as well. are nationally determined contributions, and these are kind of individual country commitments from the national government to the UNFCCC. They estimate Pakistan's climate adaptation costs at between $7 to $14 billion annually. So the two main responses to climate change are adaptation, which are actions to prevent or minimize the damage from climate change, and mitigation, which is preventing or reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. So our country would obviously focus more on adaptation because, as I mentioned earlier, our overall per capita carbon footprint is still very, very low compared to other countries. So some of the mitigation initiatives which have already been announced by the government include, a 60%, that 60% for energy produced by 2030 will be generated by renewable resources, including large hydro. One of the commitments, again, is that by 2030, 30% of all the new vehicles sold will be EV vehicles, electric vehicles. The country is already committed that by 2020, no further generation of power will be done through imported coal. And for the local technologies, there's an increased focus on coal gasification and liquefaction, which are relatively less polluting than other technologies. And finally, the billion-free tsunami project is being scaled up and maintained even under the new government. And this is estimated to sequester a significant amount of carbon dioxide and will be meeting our mitigation targets internationally. But on the other hand, Pakistan being a low-income country and one of the, there's a transition cost associated with this. And so we've put in some conditional mitigation commitments as well. Around 12 gigawatts of power plants are under construction, requiring around $20 billion. To reach our renewable energy commitments, almost $80 billion will be required by 2040. An estimated $20 billion is required to upgrade the current transmission system, and this includes initiatives like smart metering to enable consumers to track their energy usage and manage their energy costs more efficiently. And finally, internationally, there's a concept called the just transition, which means that countries that were not required or which were not responsible for the current emission scenario should not be the ones to suffer. So the international finance, climate finance, should be used to essentially buy out their new coal mines, which would cost an estimated $18 billion, and replacing these with wind and solar, so essentially substituting the power with renewables, would require an extra sort of $13 billion. So these are sort of just some large numbers that I wanted to put out there, but overall the figure is quite high. So globally, there is an increasing interest in enhancing supply chain transparency, enhancing your ESG disclosure and performance. There's a very commonly, shared quote that what you can't manage what you can't measure. So there's increasing interest in actually measuring your carbon footprint, your emissions footprint, and identifying where in your supply chain the greatest emissions come from. There are three different categories. Scope 1 emissions include the country's direct footprint, the company's operational footprint, right? So across your supply chain, where the greatest emissions are coming from. Scope 2 emissions include your emissions from purchased electricity, which is from the central grid. And then Scope 3 includes your upstream and downstream suppliers and your logistics and transport and all of that, including employee travel. So these are sort of the more technical terms, and I will not get into those in too much detail. But eventually, this is going to filter into Pakistan as well. These are just some of the global reporting frameworks that are commonly used, and they meet different requirements, depending on if you're investor focused or if you're client focused or customer focused. The UN Principles for Responsible Investment, these are essentially integrating ESG into investment decision-making, targeted more towards clients, asset owners, and managers. The GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, has been already used by some of the listed companies in Pakistan, and this essentially helps you to track your ESG footprint and report it in a way that is comparable with other companies in your industry. The SASB, again, this is, a lot of these are evolving as we speak, and there's a lot of interest in actually increasing transparency and essentially allowing you to compare the overall ESG rating between different companies, both from an investor perspective and then also from your customer perspective. And then the other is the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and your CDP, which is the questionnaire that companies can fill out and also report on in their sustainability reports. But just to put things in a little bit more perspective, this should not be viewed as a scenario of doom and gloom. Essentially, there is a lot of opportunity out there in these different sectors that I talked about earlier. There are opportunities for resource efficiency and greater optimization. There are opportunities in the EV industry, in the renewable energy industry, and also in direct air capture and storage. So there's a lot of interesting emerging technologies, even for climate resilient agriculture. And globally, there's a lot of interest, I think, and a lot of research being done, and Pakistan should definitely be moving towards that a little bit more. So here, I will not go into this in too much detail. These are just the basics of carbon neutrality. As I mentioned, there's a balance between what you emit and what you absorb. So overall, there should be no new emissions being basically released into the atmosphere by 2050. And then the ways to do this, either you decarbonize your operating model by reducing the carbon footprint across your supply chain. You can do this either through greater efficiency, by moving towards renewables, reducing packaging. And some companies are even going further ahead and becoming carbon positive. There are a lot of different terms that are currently being used, but essentially they're all saying the same thing, that you absorb more carbon dioxide and release less into the atmosphere. Carbon offsets are another very interesting model for compensating for emissions made elsewhere. And Article 6 of the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was formalized in COP26 last year, essentially they're trying to formalize a carbon market. Some countries like Singapore, the UAE, even Saudi Arabia are coming up with their internal carbon markets to enable carbon trading. Internationally, of course, Pakistan, I think, has immense resources which could be used to offset emissions elsewhere, again, because we're very well endowed and have great potential for renewables. And finally, carbon credits are, again, they're a specialized carbon offset tool, and they issue tradable permits and certificates which can be traded either within a country or internationally as well, in exchange for reducing your overall footprint. So just to summarize some of the key takeaways, Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change in the world. We have already experienced very severe impacts in the form of severe floods, drought, heat waves, and then in the longer term, there is an impact on food security, agriculture, and water. Any impact on the agriculture, which is the backbone of our economy, will be drastic and permanent. So something needs to be done to address this very quickly, because it's essentially a real-time imperative. The average annual economic losses, as estimated by the World Bank, are around $3.8 billion, and these are just from natural disasters and a lack of preparedness. These costs will largely be incurred from higher probabilities of more intense and unpredictable events. I've mentioned these earlier, along with sort of the adverse effects of soil erosion and saline intrusion. The green transition is necessary, but it is costly. Pakistan's adaptation needs, again, to summarize, are between $7 to $14 billion per annum, with 70% being just pure infrastructural costs. And the cost of the energy transition alone will require around $101 billion by 2030. There is a lot of climate finance that is available for countries like Pakistan. So I do think that there is a very strong need to be able to access that and to bring that finance to Pakistan and then channel it effectively in order to address some of these impacts and better prepare the country for what's to come. So I'll stop right there, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take those.
Thank you very much, Maha. It was an excellent presentation and really was insightful for us, especially for the CFA Society Pakistan members and the financial industry in general, where we really focus more on the economic challenges. So we are in the midst of the economic crisis, and we have been here because we have long been ignoring the challenges, the long-term challenges, and the policymakers' response towards that. Now, the alarm has been sound on various occasions. From time to time, we keep hearing about the updates about the challenges, the severity and gravity of the situation. You also highlighted. So how do you feel in terms of the policymakers' response until now, the recognition of the problem, the response, and certainly we are a resource lacking country, so we cannot put in a lot of resources. But so what do you think the low-hanging fruit for policymakers in terms of response towards the sustainability?
So unfortunately in Pakistan right now, largely for the corporate sector at least, ESG reporting and disclosure is largely voluntary. It's not a requirement for the Pakistan Stock Exchange or for any of the listed companies. At the federal level, of course, the government has, I think, done a lot of work on developing a coherent climate change policy, which is better actually than a lot of other countries. And we're already doing quite a lot of work on nature-based solutions. But in the long term, I mean, I think it's the right time to really start thinking about transitioning the transport sector to a more sustainable platform. And of course, the energy sector, eventually will need to shift to a larger component of renewables. I think these things will take a lot of time, but globally, actually, people are, looking at this as a climate emergency. And I think that urgency maybe is not quite there yet, but should be. So that's sort of what I'm looking at right now. But for the corporate sector, at least, I think that voluntary nature of the policy, there's no push as such for companies to maybe become necessarily more transparent about their ESG footprints and impacts. I know that there is an ESG task force that the PICG has been working on, the Pakistan Institute for Corporate Governance. So once I think that is made more robust, then there might be more regulation, which is required, I think, in Pakistan, at least from a climate perspective.
Okay, so I'll invite the audience as well. If they want to ask any question, you can type in the chat box and we'll ask questions. So I'll go to the audience, and the first question from Asif Qureshi. He has requested to throw some light on the Pakistan's commitment on various international climate-related agreements, how binding they are, how they are implemented, and what are the consequences, or what are the modalities of the implementation there.
So again, the biggest problem with the COP26 and the international climate commitments is that there is very little accountability. Again, a lot of this is largely voluntary. There's a lot of, I would say, country pressure to decarbonize, and of course, the developed economies are taking this seriously. So, that's where the pressure is coming from. And in Pakistan, at least the textile industry, what we're seeing is, because most of their clients are based in the European Union and the United States, so they are the ones who are actually most active in meeting some of these regulations and requirements, and actively decarbonizing their supply chains, setting emissions reduction targets, and trying to align their ESG practices with international best practices. But overall, I mean, as a country, this is still largely voluntary. India, for example, they've committed to net zero by 2070. But again, it really takes away from the urgency of the issue, because climate change is happening now. It's and the impacts are being felt right now. So doing something, 50 or 60 years from today will not really make much of a difference. So I think, like I mentioned, that urgency is really missing. In terms of the fiscal commitments required to meet them, so under our NDCs, Pakistan has already estimated that the cost of transition to clean energy will cost around $100 million US, 100 billion, I'm sorry. So that's a large number, and again, because most of our energy comes from fossil fuels at present, even though we have made commitments to 60% by 2030. A lot of funding is required for basic infrastructure, for investment in power plants, and eventually, if you want to phase out coal, then the international climate finance, significant proportions will be required to sort of ensure a just transition for Pakistan, because historically, we are not the ones responsible for the scenario that we're facing right now. So I guess those are some of the numbers I think I've talked about earlier as well. But overall, I mean, they've estimated $100 billion a year just for transition in the energy sector. So it's quite a high, I would say, significant number.
Okay. So you also highlighted, in fact, I made it a point to put this chart in my background as well, where Pakistan is being highlighted among the most stressed regions in terms of water availability or scarcity. So what is really happening on that side? I think I saw water policy as well, and there is water ministry apparently as well. There's a lot of talk about dams, but until now we haven't seen big progress on that. But really, in terms of water sustainability, where do you see the progress happening in the country?
So the biggest inefficiency in our water sector is, the agricultural sector. It's irrigation, because most of our irrigation channels are open. There's a high rate of evaporation, a high rate of wastage in the irrigation sector. Globally, a lot of better technologies are out there. The strip irrigation, which is being used, I think, in some parts of Pakistan. And of course, there's an initial capital investment that is required to transition to this. For example, if we were to convert all of our farms to more efficient irrigation practices, there will be a significant kind of upfront cost. But in the long term, there are a lot of benefits to doing this. So, Pakistan has been criticized, for example, for exporting water and in the form of rice, right? Because that is one of our biggest exports in the food sector. So, and it's one of the most water-intensive crops as well. So I think this is something that we really, can work on, because the technologies are available. And there have been proposals to use covered channels for irrigation, for example. So that is one of the low-hanging fruit, I would say. But overall, also, I think there does need to be increased awareness among the overall population. And the growing population is obviously putting a lot of stress on existing water resources. So in cities like Karachi and Islamabad, because a lot of people are migrating to these urban centers, it's putting pressure on existing water resources just because there just isn't enough need in these cities. So I think better planning would obviously be required. But like I said, the technologies are available. There's a strong behavior change and advocacy component, I think, that we could definitely benefit from. And right now, in Pakistan, water is considered a free resource. It's globally in most countries, water is, and there's a price for water similar to like your gas meters and your meters. So in Pakistan, it's considered a free resource. So until and unless that awareness or that pricing is not there, there's very little incentive to use it in a more efficient way, or to use it in a more responsible way, I would say. So that's, I think, what's really required in the coming years to avoid like a disaster-like situation down the line.
Yeah. So I'm sure there will be a lot of resources available, a lot of research available on Pakistan's water problems and the solutions for that, suggestions for that. One particular resource that I came across, because I used to follow a lot of SPP updates. So it was back in 2017, there was a chapter from State Bank on water scarcity and some of the possible solutions. And while I was going through that, a lot of problems are still like back 3 years or maybe 10 years ago that have been highlighted, and not much progress has been made on that side. One particular interesting concept, in fact, that has been addressed in water policy as well, as was more crop per drop. So it means you have to be efficient or more productive in terms of utilizing water for crop productivity and selection and prioritizing crops, but particularly we haven't yet seen any change. It also suggested about pricing water so that water can be conserved and people can be more conscious about the economics and sustainability. But nothing has really happened. So what has happened to really that water policy, if you are aware of that? Because I found that policy also very relevant. It talks about all the probably right solutions as well. But where has it gone?
So this, unfortunately, is a problem, I think, that a number of different areas are facing. And I think this is largely due to, uncertainty. And then there was a lot of attention, I think, on the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of our resources and our time was devoted towards that. But I'm hopeful that in the next kind of, coming years, actually, there should be increased attention towards these. As you mentioned, the solutions are there. The water policy is very well written, I would say. And essentially just the implementation is lacking, and that needs to be done urgently through the existing kind of infrastructure that we already have. I have no, I would say, easy answer to that. It's more of like a governance and an implementation problem. There's very little that I think we as the private sector necessarily can do around that. Since it's a federal issue, it needs to be tackled at the kind of topmost levels.
Okay, so now you mentioned about the corporate sector. So you mentioned about some of the opportunities in the big businesses and areas like EV and probably solar as well. But the existing industry, the corporate sector, where do you think that steps can be taken to play our role as stakeholder?
So again, I think the biggest incentive from the private sector is investment into these areas. And I know that certain industries within Pakistan are already actively exploring the EV space, for example. Even in other countries like Bangladesh, they are piloting different vehicle designs, even like the rickshaws, for example, and converting them to EVs. And it makes a lot of sense, I think, in urban areas where there are short kind of travel times in a very densely populated city like Karachi, for example. So you can develop the charging infrastructure at a very kind of not a huge distance, or essentially just to replace existing petrol stations with EV infrastructure or add that to it, right? So
you also highlighted, sorry to interrupt, in your profile about working with a commercial bank on the climate change and its response. So would you like to share, if it's shareable for the benefit of audience, what was it and how did it really help to the cause?
Sure, yes. So I actually worked with GS Bank, which is one of the top banks of Pakistan, on getting their accreditation for the Green Climate Fund. And this is a $100 billion global fund for climate mitigation and adaptation projects. So they were actually the first commercial bank from Pakistan to become accredited to receive international funding. And just this year on May 16th, actually, they received their first kind of project, which it essentially makes access to solar power more affordable for residential consumers. Because what we're seeing is, because a lot of the solar panels, etc., are imported from other countries, there's a lag in financing, and the capital costs for solar home system are quite high. So what this does is that it provides a bit of buffer financing to residential consumers and to smaller consumers, so less than 1 megawatt, and enables them to access projects. So it's one of their first initial projects that has been approved, but there is a lot of scope, I think, there as well. And the other kind of projects which are already ongoing under the GCF in Pakistan are the GLOF projects, the glacier floods. And I think some of us saw that visual when the Hussainabad bridge in Gilgit, was destroyed. And this is because early warning systems had been set in place, to monitor the glacial lake outburst flood, which enabled kind of people to get away. And because they were tracking so closely, there was much less, I would say, loss of life and destruction than there could have been had that early warning system not been in place. So these are the sorts of measures that really are needed, and where the private sector can then step in to ensure that such systems, including disaster risk reduction systems and preparedness systems, are in place, both for the corporate sector and then in other sectors as well. And I think Sorry,
kindly complete your sentence.
So I was just going to say, like I said, there's a lot of opportunity in, to essentially invest in these sectors. And I think it could be very profitable in the long term as well, especially in agriculture and some of the technologies. So there's this company recently which has received funding from venture capital as well. So they allow drone seeding or monitoring of like plants in real time through GIS systems. Again, these technologies are widespread internationally, but in Pakistan, again, most of our agricultural practices are still done manually. So I think like a component of automation and a component of bringing that research, real-time research to the farming community, I think can be very timely right now.
Okay. So I'll just take the question as well. So Faizan is asking, should we work towards a voluntary carbon market, incentivizing monetization of carbon saving initiatives? In fact, I'll just add to this question. There were a lot of talks about carbon credits a few years back. I'm probably missing the term, where companies could trade those carbon credits and generate revenues, and probably some of the corporates, in fact, Fatma Fertilizer in Pakistan also did some work on that. So, but even in the news flow in the international media, we talk about those markets has slowed down a bit. What is really happening on that side?
All right, so this is 2008 or 9, and I was actually at Engro at that time, and they also had a CDM project that we worked on quite actively. So at that time, carbon credits are, so you develop a baseline which shows how you are reducing the baseline emissions by either through renewable energy or through like a less energy intensive or less emissions intensive technology or project. So there are a series of technical steps that you need to follow, and then you are verified and accredited to be generating these carbon credits. But in 2008, if you remember, there was a global recession, and after that, in 2009, the price of carbon fell from $35 per ton to something like, I think it was less than $5 per ton. So essentially, that made the entire project unviable and unprofitable, and that's why kind of the interest around that died down quite a lot. And this is under the previous architecture of the UNFCCC. It was called the Clean Development Mechanism. And even then, actually, India and China were the two countries which managed to register over 200 projects with the UNFCCC. And in Pakistan, I think there were less than 10 projects that were registered, even though there was a lot of scope, I think. And again, because some of these proposals can be quite technical, so I think that sort of technical capability maybe was not there. And there is an initial capital cost to this as well that goes into developing a carbon offset project that is eligible to generate carbon credits. So I think, again, what the government really needs to focus on is that capacity building. And within the private sector, I think, there is a lot of interest in going that route. But so one of the things that we do as well as a consultancy is help companies kind of prepare their project proposals for voluntary carbon markets, which is something that's already been used in the last years. There's the gold standard in the UK, and there's Vera. But hopefully by COP27, which is, I think it's in September of this year, by then the Article 6 of the Glasgow Climate Pact should be operationalized. And after that, sort of international carbon credit trading will again become revitalized. And I think Pakistan should definitely, be part of that market and not lose out as they did in the previous sort of architecture.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions. Second question is about Karachi. So how vulnerable is Karachi to the climate change, especially those living along the coastal belt and this land reclamation? And we continue to hear about how risky are the high-rise building projects there.
Karachi as a city overall, there are a number of different factors, I think, compounding the climate vulnerability for a city like Pakistan. 2 years ago, I think it was 2020, when there was unprecedented rainfall. So I think around over 200 inches of rainfall in a 2-day period. And because Karachi is so densely populated, so in another city, maybe the impact would not have been so high, but because Karachi is so densely populated and because there's been a lot of construction on our traditional kind of drainage areas, there are no open spaces, so that water could not drain and it could not be absorbed, for weeks on end. And there were, again, billions of dollars worth of destruction across the city. The authorities were not prepared. The following year, of course, they got pumps and how to kind of pump water out of basements and things like that. But had we been better prepared, maybe the impact would not have been so high. But Karachi, again, because for these very reasons, because it's one of the most populated cities, densely populated cities, in the world, and because of this unplanned sort of growth and on zones which should not actually have been built upon, so that natural drainage is not there anymore. So that's kind of the impact from flooding. And then the second is from heat waves. So there's this thing called the urban heat island effect. And, especially in a very concrete heavy construction, which Karachi is unfortunately becoming every day, it tends to trap those heating elements even more and kind of prolongs the heat wave. So traditionally, Karachi would have like an open breeze. We are located next to the coast. There's but evenings generally, it becomes quite pleasant. But because of that urban heat wave, heat island effect, that particular heat wave that happened in 2015 was extra lethal, I would say. So for these very reasons, because of unplanned construction, overpopulation, and a lack of proper drainage, so these kind of factors are compounding some of the impacts of climate change. The ones that we've seen so far are, like I said, the heat waves and the floods. And the floods, I mean, again, these are not long-term kind of monsoon flooding. It could be like a single day event, or it could be like one unprecedented event that brings the entire city to a standstill. And these are kind of the things that we need to be really prepared for as a city. Just better disaster management practices and better preparation. I think that's one of the things we can do, at least in the short term.
Well, that's something we haven't really seen, and nor we see the capacity for any preparedness either in the country or in the city budgets. But let's pray we are not challenged in terms of any natural calamity or changes by that. So another question from Ahmed is, would there be any climate change premium in future, including in the cost of capital? And have explored the inflationary impact of that in Pakistan's economy? That's an interesting question.
So there's actually a book by Bill Gates. It's called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And he actually talks about the premiums, which are the extra costs that are incurred in order to make technologies which are currently considered unaffordable, affordable in the near future. So yes, there is an initial cost that is affiliated with making that initial investment today. But I think in the longer term, it could be 5 years, 10 years, the payback period should actually make that cost affordable. And there are ways to do this. It can be a bit technical, so I won't get into kind of details, but I mean, it's similar to any investment that you make, as long as you factor in the ESG cost of your investment. So right now, these are externalities that we are not necessarily accounting for in our analysis, in our financial analysis of the project. But if these costs were factored in as, instead of externalities, if they were actually factored in, then I think the premium would eventually just become profitable in the kind of term for the project.
Okay. The next question is, how can industry get financing on green projects? In fact, you could add to that, you mentioned about the accreditation for GS Bank you worked on. So is that also available for other industries along with the financing options?
Yes, definitely. So GS Bank is one of the accredited entities in the on-lending and blending category, so they can actually lend their finance to other companies. Like to the other accredited entities in Pakistan, I think are NRSP, the National Rural Support Program. Other than that, there are a lot of climate finance opportunities available, I would say, globally as well, either through the multilateral development banks, the ADB, the World Bank, IFC has special financing for carbon mitigation and adaptation projects. We've already seen Pakistan's first green bond through WAPDA, successfully kind of launched last year. So I think it's essentially just being very creative and innovative in the kind of projects that we undertake. So definitely, I think there's a lot of scope there in the climate finance space. Green bonds are, again, I think there's a lot of interest in that space, both in Pakistan and then globally as well.
Okay. So Shayan is asking, are there any rules and regulations related to ESG reporting in place locally in Pakistan? I think for listed companies, he's asking. I don't think probably I can answer that as well. But probably, Maha, you can shed light if there is any work on that happening.
Right now, according to the Pakistan Stock Exchange, companies are only required to report on 2 SDGs, 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Beyond that, there is no requirement as such for companies to report on ESG targets or disclosure. There are incentives, of course. So recently, the IFC, there was a gender diversity award that was given to one of the companies in Pakistan for having a more inclusive workforce, for example. And there are others, there are annual CSR awards, but I think the OICCI, the Chamber of Commerce, is doing a lot of work on advocacy around ESG, as well as the Pakistan Institute for Corporate Governance, the PCB, So all of these, I think there's a lot of interest, and I think it's just going to take a bit of time, maybe in the next few months to a year, to formalize this as an institution. But I mean, eventually, I mean, even if it's not mandatory in Pakistan, as I mentioned, for the export-oriented industries, particularly the textile sector and the ones that are exporting abroad, they've already started, incorporating ESG performance and disclosure into their sustainability reporting practices because it's a requirement for their clients and for their customers. So regardless of whether it's mandatory or voluntary in Pakistan, I think in order to stay competitive in international markets, at least, this will eventually become a requirement for most companies, Pakistani companies.
Okay, but as you mentioned, they are currently at the voluntary stage, especially for the textile sector.
Well, for all the listed companies, yeah.
Okay. So again, the next question, I think you have already answered, but probably you want to add more to it. So what challenges can Pakistan's exporters supplying to international brands face due to global focus on reducing carbon emissions in the supply chain?
Right. So, I mean, I think the most obvious challenge is just losing out on your client markets, right? Because, I mean, even if you are competitive from a price point, if you are not factoring in your ESG footprint, then because, I mean, globally, there's a lot of interest, like I said, in being more climate conscious. Your consumers want, items that are sustainably produced. Like a pair of jeans, for example, right? So, you'll see like in some of these international brands, sustainably sourced or fair trade, or these certifications which show that the entire supply chain is not using child labor, for example, or it's it's made with recycled materials. So all of that is gaining a lot of traction, especially across the European Union and the US markets. So I mean, if our suppliers are not kind of at par with other countries which are moving ahead on this agenda very quickly, then they do stand to lose out parts of their client markets internationally.
Okay, so next question is from Shehzad. He wants to know how does it really work in terms of ROI returns for the cost of taking such initiatives while speaking to stakeholders in Pakistan. What are their challenges to undertake some of the conservation initiatives?
So again, like I said, I think if you put a cost ESG footprint, right? So if you have a cost for your effluent, if you have a cost on your water consumption, if you have a cost on your energy consumption or your emissions footprint, for example, if you're putting a dollar price to it, so automatically I think it becomes a part of your investment proposal. So just factor it in like any other cost. I don't think there's a necessarily specialized way to do this, but essentially what's considered an externality or an environmental externality today should essentially be into your entire project cost, and that will give you, the ROI for your project.
Okay, so Mahnur is asking, does domestic coal produce fewer GHG emissions? Is it of better quality, etc., or is it a policy to reduce reliance on imported fuels, simply a form of protectionism / cheaper fuel?
So indigenous coal, I would say, is not as high quality. I think most of it is lignite, which is a relatively low burning fuel, but it's largely used in Germany and in other countries as well. So I wouldn't say it's I think most of it, again, this is not directly related to this topic, but it's more in the kind of larger context of energy security, right? So you don't want to be dependent on imports similar to like LNG or for other imported fuels, because supply chains can be very quickly disrupted, as we've seen in the recent COVID-19 pandemic, and as a result of the war with Ukraine as well. Globally, a lot of countries are facing challenges for their imported fuels. So I think indigenous coal, one element of it is that it does enhance Pakistan's energy security because it's an indigenous resource, and that's why I think it has been part of the energy mix. And again, overall, I think Pakistan's coal consumption compared to countries like China or India or even the US is much lower. So that's yes.
Certainly, yes. We have I think among the lowest contributors coal as an energy resource, and there is a lot of effort needed on that side to develop it further. In fact, the whole world is realizing, right? There is economics and there is balance between the climate challenges. Probably energy industry globally is already complaining about the lower investment because of ESG that has been made in the energy production and oil prices. are already haunting the whole world. So the next question from Manur is, are policymakers focusing on inevitable reality that Pakistan needs to develop alternatives to current farming practices?
I think, like I said, that is one area where we need emergency attention because it's the largest sector of the economy, and I think more could be done there. I don't think the relative authorities are doing as much as needs to be done, especially in that space. We need to train the farmers. We need to deploy some of these state-of-the-art technologies that are being used globally, and especially for the subsistence farmers and smallholder farmers who don't have the capital to be able to make this investment themselves. I think they will need some sort of support from the private sector or for the government in order to stay competitive and in order to essentially practice these climate resilient agricultural practices. Because I think the large farming families or communities, they can easily make that investment themselves, and they do, I think, see a future in future benefit to kind of making that initial investment today. But the smallholder farmers or subsistence farmers, which is the majority of our agricultural sector, I think they don't have the awareness or the technical or financial capability to make that decision right now. So I think they need a lot of support, both from the government and from the private sector as well.
Okay, in fact, I think related to agriculture, I was reading somewhere the livestock, in particular cows, Pakistan is basically an agriculture country, and we have a lot of reliance on this livestock and agriculture production. So there are concerns with regards to livestock as well. Could you shed some light on that? I think it's related to probably carbon emissions and nitrogenous production.
So cows, they produce a lot of methane, which is one of the greenhouse gases responsible for climate change. Right now, actually, there are ways to modify their feed to make it less. So the food that the cows eat, their fodder can be modified to reduce the amount of methane being produced. Globally, there's also a movement to eat less meat, to shift towards vegetarianism as one of the ways to combat climate change. And these are largely behavioral changes. But again, I think from Pakistan's perspective, because historically, this country has not been responsible for most of the emissions that we are seeing today, I think such practices cannot be imposed on the country, of course. And as a percentage of global populations, right, our meat consumption is still significantly lower than a lot of other countries. So this is quite, it's an international conversation that is happening. And from an individual perspective, of course, you are free to make that shift. But I think such measures might not be applicable to Pakistan at the moment because compared to other countries, our footprint, like I said, even from a consumption perspective, meat consumption or dairy consumption, it's still very, very low.
And in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of per capita, so where would Pakistan be? I would assume we would be very low in terms of this contribution towards this climate worsening.
It's among the 20 lowest countries. I don't have the exact figure, and it changes from year. But it's definitely not among the top in the top 100. It's among the bottom 20, I would say. The highest ranked countries are, I think, Qatar, and then the UAE and the US and China right now, in terms of per capita carbon dioxide emissions.
Okay, so we have one question more. How effective is regenerative agriculture for attaining climate goals? How developed is the carbon market for agriculture-related carbon credits?
So regenerative agriculture, what it does is essentially that it's a very efficient way of doing agriculture. You're not putting any fertilizer or pesticides or any of that. There's very little disturbance to the soil. And what soil does is that it actually absorbs and retains carbon dioxide. So it's a natural carbon sink, and that's what regenerative agriculture essentially does. It's that there's very little artificial involvement. So like right now what we're seeing is, especially in Punjab in the smog months, right, there's a lot of crop burning that happens after every crop cycle to clear the field for the next planting season. So regenerative agriculture, does not allow any of that. It's a very natural and organic way of doing agriculture, similar to what was practiced, let's say, 30 to 40 years ago, right? So traditional methods of agriculture with minimum disturbance to the topsoil. And that enables the soil and the crops to absorb excess greenhouse gas emissions rather than become a source. So it's trying to reverse the process by storing more than it emits.
Okay. So one question that I just wanted to ask from personal interest, and I think to sum up the overall situation as well, is that I mean we continue to see Pakistan being compared on the global indices. Of course, we rank among the most sensitive countries or most stressed countries. But is there any figure or available where we can really see how the situation is worsening with respect to each year? Is there any quantitative index, absolute index for Pakistan, that how worsened we have become with respect to last year? How do we measure that?
So the first one, and I think I mentioned that the German Watch Global Climate Risk Index, the CRI, that's commonly used. And then there's the Inform Index, which is essentially it's a disaster risk management tool. So that just kind of ranks you in terms of your vulnerability to climate change. There are several.
Is it an absolute index, or is it relative to the region or other countries in the world?
It's a global index, so it ranks almost 190 countries, on these vulnerabilities, and there's a methodology that's included, as part of your the report. I mean, this is being measured, I would say, quite studiously by a number of different research companies. So it should be easily available online. It's not something we need to. It's already being tracked and it's available.
Okay, so Maha, next 5 years, how much worried should we be? Is it 10-year problem? We have discussed every year the temperatures are rising. Yes, the risk of flooding is increasing. The crop dependency is increasing with the growing population. In terms of 5 years, or in terms of maybe 10 years, where do you see really things really stretching and really putting a lot of constraint on resources, and where you think things could be really alarming for Pakistan? And we see 2040, 2030, but what you really see would be the inflection points.
So globally, I mean, what we're seeing is that even if carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions were to come to zero this year, the emissions will continue rising for a number of years. They will hit a peak, and then they will start to decline. And this is only if everyone were to stop emitting, greenhouse gases as of today, right? So even if we follow a very stringent emissions reductions pathway in the next, let's say, year or 5 years, the global emissions will continue to rise for a number of years. And a lot of people are saying we've already, scientists are saying that we've already kind of passed that tipping point, right? So according to the Paris Agreement, the idea was to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century to avoid catastrophic climate change. But what we're already seeing is catastrophes occurring literally every other day in some part of the world or the other. So in Pakistan, to just put it in a local context, as I mentioned, the trends that we're seeing, the greatest impacts, at least from the economic perspective, are on water and food security. These are the two, I would say, most important areas to focus on. And then thirdly would be, of course, health, and that's not directly related to this presentation, but health is one of the biggest impacts of climate change in Pakistan: heat stress, lower productivity of the workforce. And then there's an increase in vector-borne diseases. The dengue season is expected to increase. It already has. So previously there would be maybe one season when they would, dengue would spread, but last year, December became another kind of a new dengue season for the basically spread of vector-borne mosquitoes, right? So these are the sorts of trends which are quite worrying, I think, from a disease perspective as well. It's something for Pakistan to definitely track and be aware of.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's the end of Q&A as well. Thank you very much, Maha. Sarvat, do we have anything else left to cover?
Thank you, Maha, and thank you, Asim, for the excellent moderation. Maha, it has been extremely valuable session for us. Thank you, both of you, once again, on behalf of the society. I'd like to ask all the participants to please share your valuable feedback. The link has been posted in the chat box as well, and you can scan this QR code. And thank you once again, and hope we'll be able to engage with you further in the future.
Thank you very much, Maha.
Lovely.
I think this topic is something where we rarely find good speakers, and today's session was really helpful in really understanding the environment, which is certainly very important. So we are really thankful to you, and we'll be looking forward to invite you again. Thank you very much.